Welcome to a Legendarium special about the Munster Uprising of 1534. In this episode, we will talk about one of the most infamous and radical groups to spring up during the Protestant Reformation. During the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation swept through northern and central Europe. It sought a revived religious life and an end to the corruption of the established Catholic Church, led by bishops like Franz von Waldeck in Munster. Reformers found a receptive audience in German towns, where many could read and write. That made it possible for people to read the Bible for themselves without help from priests. Educated burghers, fond of virtue signaling, as we say today, often embraced new ideas and, with Protestant clergy, spread them among the working class. Preachers and teachers came to taverns, marketplaces, and, of course, churches. Lay committees took power from churchmen by appointing and dismissing ministers, controlling finances, and managing social services. Ministers and their families led exemplary bourgeois lives among their fellow burghers, something a celibate priest could never do. Unfortunately, local oligarchs also embraced Protestant teachings to anoint themselves as a God-given aristocracy of merit, gifted wealth and power in exchange for their Christian virtue. Local priests taught obedience to these self-serving oligarchies, which often underpaid and overworked the working class. Just like any magnate targeted during the Peasants' War of 10 years previously, these oligarchs could face the occasional uprising. Given the time, these rebellions took on a religious character. During the 16th century, Munster Anabaptists became one of many sects that developed once the Reformation splintered the Catholic Church. They believed that only a person willingly baptized as an adult could enter the kingdom of heaven, something that horrified both Catholics and even many fellow Protestants. In January 1534, a Dutch baker from Haarlem named Jan Matthies set out for Munster because he heard it warmly received Anabaptists like him. For years, he had been persecuted and chased out of different towns. However, Jan heard that Munster tolerated forward-thinking ideas like his own, such as pacifism and the separation of church and state. However, the city also crackled with apocalyptic fervor, for the biblical exegesis of Melchior Hoffman declared the end time would occur in 1534 in Munster. Indeed, the events of the Reformation were so remarkable that many in Europe believed they augured the end times. Within a few months of his arrival, Jan Matthies built up a following, preaching that the end of the age of slavery would come soon and that the Lord would soon return. Around March of 1534, they began running half-clothed through the streets, singing about the peace and prosperity that awaited God's chosen ones. They kicked out the city council, and Matthies proclaimed that to prepare for his coming, the children of God must receive baptism. Some 1,500 citizens, ranging from artisans to oligarchs, accepted baptism and awaited the second coming, said to arrive in Easter 1534. The Zealots drove out adults who refused baptism, while Anabaptists from surrounding villages flowed into Munster to replace them. Jan Matthies declared himself king and proclaimed that Munster would be the new Jerusalem, spared from God's avenging angels who would destroy 9 out of 10 people that Easter. In February of that year, a radical council led by Matthies ordered the destruction of statues, paintings, illuminated manuscripts, musical instruments, and anything else that Matthies judged to be ungodly. Yet not all men of Munster joined in Mathis's religious revolution, especially the town's bishop, Franz von Waldeck, who long struggled with the city council for control of Munster. Bishop von Waldeck gathered some Landsknecht mercenaries and surrounded the city with huge barricades. As a warning to those within the city's walls, von Waldeck chopped off the hands and ears of anyone who tried to break through his blockade, which only further radicalized the rebels, a frightening thought. They began to engage in acts of mass penitence, performed wild and ecstatic dances in the streets, and pooled their belongings in a primitive communist state. In this biblical society, men could marry as many women as they chose. Mathis himself amassed a personal harem, and any woman accused by her husband of insubordination could be executed in the streets, and no woman could reject a husband who claimed her in accordance with Mathis's rulings. When Easter passed without the apocalypse, Mathis left Munster and charged the bishop's army. The bishop's Landsknecht mercenaries cut his followers down, and back in Munster, a tailor's apprentice named Johann Buckelson, perhaps sensing an opportunity, declared himself King Johann the Just of Munster. He began keeping 6 wives and an elaborate court, ruling as an Old Testament king in early modern Germany. Jan Mathis soon regained power and suddenly decided that God granted him the authority to execute his fellow men without trial. Capital punishment for minor offenses became common, with most of the victims being women, unsurprisingly. One of the most infamous crimes from this era saw Jan chop off the head of one of his wives because she publicly criticized his extravagant lifestyle at a time when conditions in the besieged city grew worse and food ran low. As von Waldeck's supporters grew more desperate, they grew ever more frenzied, even holding orgies in the streets of Munster. On June 25, 1534, a refugee named Gresbeck led hundreds of von Waldeck's soldiers into town using a secret entry. The bishop's men fought their way through the narrow streets, covering the cobblestone streets with blood. By the time the city surrendered, the bishop's men had killed 600 armed Anabaptists. Von Waldeck threw Jan and his 2 highest-ranking supporters into prison. Soon after, the bishop's men dragged the 3 jailed rebels to a scaffold, where his men tore the flesh from their bodies with red-hot tongs before a jeering crowd. The 2 high supporters had their tongues ripped out, for they used them to preach blasphemy, while von Waldeck had his genitals chopped off, which were then nailed to the city gate for every passerby to see. Bishop von Waldeck then placed the 3 mutilated bodies into iron cages and hoisted them up to the tower of Munster's St. Lambert Church. Since the rebels emptied St. Lambert's church of its decorations, their bodies would now adorn the church, preaching obedience to all who saw. The rotting corpses remained there for 50 years, perhaps a warning to others to remember their place and remember it well. The 3 human-sized cages have been repaired and replaced several times since then, but nearly 500 years later, they still hang for all to see. And after this taste of radical rule, Munster returned to Orthodox faith and remains staunchly Catholic to this day. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.